Hey guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 2070 reference PCB from, well, EVGA here, but this is the same PCB you would find on like a NVIDIA Founders Edition card because, well, this is the reference PCB as much as NVIDIA likes to pretend like like the Founders cards, Founders Edition cards aren't reference cards. They very much are. You're not going to find a card with a worse PCB than a Founders Edition. It just so happens that Founders Editions are generally a lot better than what NVIDIA used to put out, so it kind of makes sense to hold them in a higher regard compared to, say, like a reference, I don't know, GTX 580 PCB, GTX 680 PCB. Yeah, definitely much better than like a GTX 680 reference PCB.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Autonomous.ai, where you can buy their automatically raising and lowering smart desk tables and table legs. If you'd like to build a raising and lowering table similar to our set table, the DIY kit is $250 and is easy to assemble to a service of your choice. If you'd prefer something pre-built, the full tables can be had from $300 and up, and you can learn more at the link in the description below for Autonomous.ai.
Anyway, today we're taking a look at the 2070, and so this is a 20 series, NVIDIA cards, so of course we have the usual set of voltages, and so let's start going around and identifying all of them, starting of course with the most important voltage regulator for, of course, the V-core, which powers the GPU core, which is why we call it V-core, and I've written that really badly, so let me just slightly tweak that. That's slightly better. Up above that, which is kind of a normal position for this, we have the memory VRM, so that's VMem, and that of course powers all of the Micron GDDR6 memory chips. Micron is currently the exclusive supplier of GDDR6 for all of the GeForce cards. Samsung also makes GDDR6, but you're not going to find it on a sort of consumer card. You might find, like, I think they're reserved only for like Tesla cards and Quadros. So yeah, Micron GDDR6 on this as usual. Down in this area, I'm assuming we have the PEX rail. I am not 100% certain about that, but this just seems like a reasonable place to put the PEX rail, because that powers the PCIe interface and some of the internal PLLs of the GPU core. This right here might be, and this is where it gets messy, because this right here I assume is the BIOS chip, because there's not really anything else that chip could be, considering where it's located. But the thing is, we have a whole bunch of regulators in this area, and at this point this becomes a bit of a mess, because we need a 5 volts rail for the VRM. So you need a VRM to power the VRM, and I'm not sure where that is. It could be this, but this could also be 1.8 volts, which would be a supporting rail for the GDDR6 memory chips, as well as powering the BIOS chip. And then this could be 5 volts, but the thing is, this also has a USB-C port, so this over here could be the USB-C power rail. So yeah, and unfortunately all of these, like 2 of them, they do seem to share, like the componentry between them seems to be the same for a couple of them. So that makes it even harder to figure out which is which. But those are the rails that are present here. I'm just not sure which one is which one, because I don't have the card in hand to check for sure. If I had the card in hand, it'd be relatively easy. So that's kind of the situation with the minor rails, and now let's get into actually looking at the V-core VRM, since it's so important, in a bit more detail. So we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 phase, so nothing crazy right there. Controlled by a chip on the back of the board, because of course there's not, like, the board's not long enough to cram it behind the V-core VRM proper, and that's this chip down here, which is that's a UP9512. So this is pretty standard for the NVIDIA cards. This goes up to 8 phases output. Of course, here it's only running on 6. So it's not running at 8, it's running 6 phase. It goes up to 2 megahertz switching frequency. It has a SM bus interface, so you can, in theory, do things like control the load line on it, configure a whole bunch of functions of the chip and like control the voltage and monitor the voltage and output current and operating temperature of the VRM, assuming NVIDIA actually allows you to access that. Last I've heard, or at least as far as I'm aware, you can't actually get access to this because the NVIDIA driver won't let you. And I think it might even be straight up disabled. So it's kind of like, the chip has it, it's just not necessarily being used. Now, for the actual voltage control, this being an NVIDIA card, it of course uses the PWM vid interface, which basically is a PWM signal from the GPU core to this chip, which is used to then set the output voltage of the VRM. Which is a nice, really like simple way of doing voltage control at like very, very rapidly. So that's why NVIDIA goes with that, because it's a really elegant way of solving your voltage control. It's just kind of unfortunate that means you also need to have, like, you need to go through the NVIDIA driver to control that. Though it is easy to physically modify, but software-wise, you need to go through the driver. Anyway, back to the front of the board. So it is a 6-phase. And each of the phases runs one of these power stages here, and these are on semiconductor NCP 310255s, and these are 55 amp power stages, or DR MOS. So they're not so that stands for driver MOS, and basically these are power stages. They're just not very intelligent compared to, say, like smart power stages, or like there's a whole bunch of other flavors of power stages that integrate things like temperature monitoring, current monitoring, overcurrent protection. These don't really do any of that. These are just a 55 amp power stage where you get a driver, and you get your and you get your high side and your low side MOSFET in one convenient package. And these are spec'd to be, well, the datasheet says these go all the way up to 55 amps, but all of the efficiency curves only go up to 40. So that makes things a little bit difficult, because basically we can't actually look at current outputs, in that 55, like how much heat each of these power stages makes at 55 5 amps output is not actually available in the datasheet, even though they are marketed as being 55 amp parts, which is always fun. But that's the same thing as all of the 60 amp power stages only going up to 50 amps in the datasheets, except for some exceptions. But most of them, if it's spec'd at 60, it only specs the heat output up to 50 amps, and then it's just like, and normally that's done because honestly, you're not gonna go to the maximum output of a power stage, just because it would produce so much heat that it'll be uncoolable, regardless of the fact that you're aware that it's going to be producing too much heat. So anyway, looking at the output at the VRM heat output for 1 volt output, so that's nice compared to, say, all of the, like on the other cards so far on the 20 series, it's always like really high-end 70 amp smart power stages from like Fairchild or something, and those are always spec'd in 1.8 volts, while these are spec'd in 1 volt, so that's very nice. 500 kilohertz switching frequency, and of course running on 5 volts, because they don't run on anything but 5 volts. You're going to be looking at sort of the following efficiencies for the following output current. So 50 amps output, which that would be roughly around stock. So stock current output would be somewhere around 150 amps average, and that now looks like an A, but there, that's a 1. Yeah. Anyway, so stock would be around somewhere, maybe slightly over that 150 amp figure. There you'd be looking at about 15 watts of heat output, which is really just fine. Like, that is not a problem whatsoever. Then once you start overclocking, assuming the power limit goes high enough, which last I've heard it doesn't, you could be looking at something like 200 amps output, and then the VRM would be producing about 24 watts of heat, which still really isn't that bad. Admittedly, that's 24 watts of heat concentrated on a much smaller surface area than, say, some of the other like VRMs we've looked at recently, right? Like, it's worth considering that this is a 6-phase, so while it might be producing only a little bit more heat than some of the 8-phase and 10-phase and 12-phase and much higher phase count VRMs at 200 amps output, this is a lot denser, so it will still end up being hotter, even though it'll be much more hotter, which that's great English right there, but it'll be like more hotter than you would necessarily expect from the very slight decrease in sort of efficiency, right? That's not a huge lost, like the efficiency isn't that much worse, but it's also denser. So that's worth keeping in mind. And then the absolute maximum current output that the datasheet really allows you to go up to easily without, well, extrapolating where the efficiency curves would go. You're looking at about 240 amps producing about 32 watts of heat, which is still manageable. Like, that's, admittedly, you will need like a VRM heatsink and some airflow, but that is still not a ridiculous amount of heat. But yeah, this is not exactly a super powerful VRM, especially compared to, say, like a 2080 or even other GPUs in this price category. This VRM is really not that impressive because, well, honestly, if you actually look at even cheaper cards like Vegas these days are cheaper than one of these. The Vega reference PCB is like ridiculous compared to this. So, you know, but obviously this doesn't need an insane VRM. It's just worth considering that, yeah, this is pretty, it fits the purpose, but it's not exactly incredibly impressive. And it's not really, it's also a bigger step down in terms of the VRM design compared to like the 2080 or the 2080 Ti. Like the downgrading of the VRM going from like a 2080 Ti to a 2080 to this thing is pretty significant. Even if the price differences are also, so kind of makes sense, but it is worth noting that this isn't super powerful, but it's not super terrible. And honestly, I don't see why NVIDIA is shipping these cards. Like, I would happily shove 240 amps through this, like even on air cooling. As long as the air cooler has good VRM cooling, I would totally just go for it and shove 240 amps through this VRM. It shouldn't really have a problem with that. This isn't so much heat that it's uncoolable. Especially considering that there's like, you know, well, there's a lot of cards in the past that do a hell of a lot worse than this right here. And those were fine. So this is a nice enough VRM. It's not super overkill, but it's fitting for sort of a mid-range card. It's kind of unfortunate that apparently the power limits are super low. The memory VRM is, in typical memory VRM fashion, massive overkill. It's like every time somebody needs to power memory, they go for ridiculous overkill. Though here we actually see a pretty big difference compared to some to the, say, the 2080 and the 2080 Ti, because for once we're not using a new sort of NVIDIA voltage controller. The voltage controller for this lovely two-phase right here, right, 1, 2, is a UP1666, and this is the same voltage controller you would find on a lot of the 10 series GPUs, and this thing is really dumb. This does not have any digital interface whatsoever. It just has a PWM vid input, and all of its functionality is configured by resistors around the chip. So that's kind of how that works right there. But it is a two-phase voltage controller, so this is a two-phase VRM. And for the actual MOSFETs, because these aren't power stages, these are straight-up MOSFETs, well, dual NFETs, because you have one chip, but there's two MOSFETs built into that chip, and then the drivers for those MOSFETs are actually built into the UP1666 here. So basically, this is hooked directly to the two MOSFETs in each of those packages over there. So these right here are Fairchild Semiconductor FDPC, can't see my notes properly, 5018SG dual NFETs. And they have a 1.6 milliohm low side, which is really, really good. And if I remember correctly, NVIDIA was using these for some reference card on the 10 series as V-Core power. So these are totally out of place for powering a couple GDDR6 memory chips. This is really, really overkill. The end result is that basically you're looking at sort of doing 1.35 volts. Actually, let's put that where it normally is. So you're looking at these doing like 1.35 volts output, because that's what GDDR6 runs on, 500 kilohertz switching frequency, and I'm assuming a gate drive voltage of 12 volts. So there, because that's just the easiest way to power them, since you have 12 volts available on the card anyway. So for 20 amps output on these, you'd be looking at about 2 watts of heat, which is in line with what you would get with like the Like the 2080 and the 2080 Ti VRMs actually get about the same efficiency, even though those VRMs are like much nicer. It's just they're massively like the components there are super over-spec'd, and you can't really like there's a limit to how efficient your VRM can be. Also, this isn't factoring in the power that this chip uses, which skews these results a bit better because the power stages do include their driver losses, which this doesn't because the drivers are built into that, and I'm calculating just the losses on the MOSFETs themselves. Anyway, going up from that 20 amps output to 30 amps, these start actually getting a bit worse and producing about 3.5 watts of heat. And then 40 amps output, you're going to be looking at about 5 watts of heat. So definitely, like these are definitely weaker. This is definitely a weaker memory VRM than what you would have on like a 2080 or a 2080 Ti. It's just not a massive difference because you're really not going to be going very high current output anyway. GDDR6, especially with just the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 chips that you have here, you're really not going to be exceeding that 20 to 30 amp output range. So this should be perfectly fine running passive as long as there's not too much heat just sort of soaking into the PCB from everything else. Because obviously these produce heat, that produces heat, this produces heat. And with the PCB being as small as it is, the PCB's own sort of thermal dissipation capabilities kind of suck because it doesn't have a lot of its own surface area, which is actually like a valid way of getting things cooled if you can't, like, if you don't want to have an actual heat sink. Having a lot of unnecessary PCB space can actually do a lot of that for you, but obviously this doesn't have that. This is as short as it can possibly be. So yeah, but the memory VRM here, again, just completely, like, definitely fitting for the fit for purpose, basically. They're nice, solid memory VRM, completely acceptable vCore. Nothing incredible, but definitely acceptable. And the last thing left is, of course, the usual 20 series power management stuff. It's probably the best term to use for it. And there is, as usual, a ton of it. So that right there is, of course, our favorite UP7651 power management chip, which is used, of course, for balancing the 12-volt inputs of the card, because you have 12 volts coming in from there and 12 volts coming in from here, and this might have a power limit of like 150, and this might have a power limit of 75 watts. And I now realize why NVIDIA has such a low power limit setting for these cards. Of course, it can only pull a maximum of 25 watts without exceeding PCIe specs. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that pretty much explains it. The stock TDP has to be like 190 or something. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, so you have like a 150 watt limit here, 75 watt limit here, and unfortunately you don't really get to choose how current goes through your phases. Well, the UP9512 can actually current balance all of your phases, but you don't have perfect control over where you're going to be getting your power from. So you could end up in situations where, you know, this has a 150 watt limit, but you're going to try to pull 200 watts through that and only like 25 watts through the PCIe slot, which is like, you're technically still under that 225 limit that the card has total, but you'd be power throttling off of the PCIe connector. So the job of the UP7651 here is to basically go and switch some of the phases of the VRM from pulling power on the 8-pin to pulling power on the PCIe slot. Or if the PCIe slot is being overdrawn, taking whatever phase is over pulling the PCIe slot and moving it onto the 8-pin. Reducing the power throttling because you're not going to be bouncing off of the power limit for each of the connectors as much as you'd normally would, and you can really actually max out the total board limit instead of just whatever power connector you're maxing out. So that's a new feature of the 20 series. Personally, I think this is completely pointless. There's a lot of cards in the past where they just didn't bother with worrying about where the power came from. It was just kind of a case, well, the card has a power limit of 300 watts. Where those 300 watts come from, that's a completely different matter and is not actually considered by the GPU whatsoever. It'll just kind of pull them wherever it can get them. which can, in theory, like lead to some issues, but you know, it's worked fine up until now. I don't really see a reason why you would, you know, bother with something like this. But NVIDIA felt like it was necessary, so they went ahead and did it. And to make sure that this chip can do its power management as quickly and as effectively as possible, you obviously need something to actually monitor all of the power going through the card, and that's done by this chip over here, which is, of course, the on-semiconductor NCP 45491. And unlike the rest of the 20 series so far, there is only one of those. Because normally you have two of them. Here you have, yes, indeed, you have just one. And it's on the back of the card. So that's how the power management is done here. You know, you have the NCP 45491 for monitoring all of your power draws, and this for balancing them. And, well, balancing your two power inputs. The voltage controller itself actually balances the current through the phases, but which phases are on which power connector the voltage controller really doesn't care about, which is why you can run into that situation where you'd be pulling more from the 8-pin than you'd be allowed to without actually maxing out the PCIe slot and then power throttling, which is why you need the extra circuitry to manage where the phases actually get their power from, because the UP9512 really doesn't know, and it really doesn't care. So that pretty much covers the power management stuff, except for the shunts, which you have one here and you have one here, and those are being monitored by that NCP 45491 chip. And you also have a shunt over here. So I guess that might be for the USB-C port, maybe? Kind of interesting. Like, why is there a third shunt? Okay, well, if you're wondering about how they're wired up, you can always just use a multimeter to check which one's connected to what. I'd have it as a guess that this one's for the 8-pin, and this one would probably be for the PCIe slot. So that is the RTX 2070 reference PCB. It's not the most impressive thing ever, but it's definitely, like, for what it has to do, it's, you know, completely adequate. You get a solid little 6-phase, and little is actually the right term to use because that is compact. And then you have a nice, you know, the nice little 2-phase, well, that's not actually a little memory VRM. You can get much smaller memory power systems, but you get a nice 2-phase memory power, and yeah, not really much else to the card than that. So that is it for the video. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support Gamers Nexus, there's store.gamersnexus.net, where you can pick up shirts as well as the mod mat, which you can kind of see in the background of the picture here. And there's also the Gamers Nexus Patreon if you'd like to support us that way. I also run a channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I do a whole bunch of other overclocking related stuff, like removing NVIDIA power limits, because I think power limits are stupid. So, yeah. That's it for the video, and goodbye.